All right. Our first panel emphasizes 3 issues in human security that I think are crucial, and just fascinating to see the contrast between Dr. Bosco's speech on international issues and the role of the international community and the strategies that they could implement on the ground. And I think these 3 presenters really highlight some of the crucial strategies and issues facing human security and development. So without further ado, our panelists are Professors Hanna, Graddy, and Shepler. And our first presenter is a PhD candidate who has done so much work with civil society groups. And I could run through the list of them all, but it'd be way too long, so let me just get right to it. It's Davina Durgana. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. So this will be a brief presentation and essentially serves to provide an overview of some of my field work on how we can use innovative approaches in civil society to augment perceived federal policy gaps in victim provision and services for those affected by human trafficking. Now, one thing I will say is that because we are kind of limited and in the interest of brevity, please do feel free to contact me after the presentation. I do have some of my more in-depth protocols that I use in each of these site examples, so I'm happy to share that information with anybody that might be interested. So, civil society. What we're going to start, with a basic level of competency here to just put it out there. Human trafficking obviously occurs in any community in the world. The only commonality that we can perceive in terms of victims is that they're vulnerable to some respect. Economically, socially, that's pretty much what we're working with. I chose the United States as a case study for this exercise in civil society because the U.S. has had a federal law against human trafficking for the last 12 years. We've got a pretty high level of technical and training capacity to address the issue, to have, even though statistics are limited in our field, we do have some marking, some evaluations that can be measured, and we can determine and assume that a lot of the solutions that I'll present to you might be reasonably effective, given the high level of training and federal funding that's gone into this over the last 12 years. Now, the reason that we've selected the 4 groups that we're going to discuss today, the National Court-Appointed Special Advocates, the Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, volunteer firefighters at large, and the nationally registered EMTs, are because those groups have very specific stakes in the communities in which we might find some of our more vulnerable persons. So this is an overview of our presentation. We're going to start by looking at who some of these vulnerable groups might be, and then going a little bit into some of the site studies I conducted, and then concluding with some of my best practices. So who's vulnerable to human trafficking? Now, there are many people that don't appear on this list, but we're going to talk about these groups mostly because the groups that I've identified really engage in a meaningful way with these organizations and can contribute something new to the field. So children and youth, that's U.S. citizen and foreign national. The reason 3 of the 4 groups that we'll be talking about work specifically with youth. That's important because they also tend to be they also tend to have less agency in terms of recognizing whatever options they may have in terms of protecting themselves, and also recognizing that they may be victims of a crime or exploitation. Runaway and homeless youth are another population kind of tied into the first, but in a way sometimes these groups, along with the LGBTQ populations, may be more vulnerable to social vulnerability. What we were seeing, and just to preface this, some of the expertise that goes into this work and some of the on-the-ground work I did to try to figure out these solutions involved working with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center and their hotline. I've been there for about a year and a half now. I've also went through the training to become a volunteer firefighter and EMT, and I am a sex trafficking specialist with the National Court-Appointed Special Advocates, and I work with Big Brothers Big Sisters on these topics. So this is where this is coming from. But something about the LGBTQ populations that's interesting is that we were seeing a lot of people that were fleeing social stigmas or lack of social acceptance in their communities, and then going to either rural or suburban population settings, and then going to an urban community, and then trying to find subsistence there. The problem is, of course, if they were minors, they may not have been able to meaningfully achieve, you know, a livelihood. They may have had various obstacles to obtaining shelter, and that's where we were seeing the incidence of survival sex. And what that is when someone feels compelled to engage in commercial sex or labor and services, even, I mean, to a certain extent, that goes to like web cameras and different kinds of exploitative sexual situations in order to survive. And clearly there are very many social nets available for people that fall into this category, but for whatever reason, whether it was outreach or whether it was the civil society groups that were already engaging in those communities, were unable to recognize that and sometimes unable to provide the right services and get them the help they needed. Foreign nationals and temporary visa holders are sometimes vulnerable to human trafficking because they may not know all of the rights that they're entitled to when they come to the U.S. Also, there are certain language barriers that may be present and also a general perception. Temporary visa holders and foreign nationals, and particularly foreign nationals if they're undocumented, they may have an even heightened level of vulnerability to what they may perceive if they were to come forward regarding any kind of exploitation. Males in need of shelter is a huge vulnerable population, and the problem with that is we have, in the United States, there's a labor trafficking network known as traveling sales crews. They're extremely abusive, very exploitative, and they attract young people ages 18 to 22 and then promise them a trip around the country and an opportunity to earn money. But then ultimately what happens is that they're given a quota each day, they're made to sleep 30 or so in a room, and then at times they may be abandoned if they stop to meet their quotas. Now, what that means is that they would call in, let's say, to the national hotline and seek assistance, but if they were over 18 years of age, sometimes that assistance would not be available to them, and particularly if they were men and perceived as, you know, as we would define them, victims of trafficking or abuse, sometimes the best option we would have would be homeless shelters. Clearly, that's not an appropriate place for victims of any crime, but the interesting situation is that in the United States, technically, there aren't as many human trafficking specific shelters. So what we would have to do in the field is partner with domestic violence organizations, other generally women-centered organizations or family-centered organizations, which is of course problematic as we're seeing very many emerging trends in trafficking that address other alternative populations. Another point of contention is adult victims of online exploitation. The FBI is doing wonderful work with the Internet Crimes Against Children task forces. They have plenty of resources to address the exploitation of children. There's a cyber tip line on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's website. There are lots of ways to report this. However, if you are an adult victim of online exploitation, or what is also very common, if you are now an adult but you had entered the sex trade or the purview of a controller when you were a minor, this is still something that you could be affected by, and you may be ineligible for even any prosecutorial assistance, notwithstanding any other victim service provision. People engaging in street-level prostitution. Now, to be distinguished, of course, from general sex work, which we would assume adults can willingly choose to engage in that work, and we would distinguish that from trafficking, where, of course, trafficking would include a controller and that someone is being forced or compelled to stay there psychologically, physically. One of the issues with this is that a lot of the foster care youth that we work with, especially with the National Court Appointed Special Advocates, are highly vulnerable to becoming runaway youth engaging in survival sex, but also one of the means of subsistence, if not survival sex, might be street-level prostitution under an individual level controller. Finally, domestic servants of international organization employees. This is a very important one because generally this population doesn't function in the public sphere. So if someone was to be a domestic servant, particularly in a labor trafficking situation of a family, they may never interface with the public sphere. So that means that they're incredibly vulnerable, and that's why organizations such as volunteer firefighters and EMTs are even more important in those instances, because we may get called into a living and a residence and be able to recognize these signs of trafficking, and that might be the one opportunity that that individual might have to obtain assistance. So the groups, the National Court Appointed Special Advocates, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and then volunteer firefighters and emergency medical technicians. Now, these groups were picked, and particularly in the US, because they generally have national membership and they possess unparalleled access to a lot of these communities. Now, when I say that, I also mean that there are plenty of infrastructural programs in place, such as the National Safe Place Program. That program is essentially, if you're a victim of a crime, you can go to many fire departments, libraries, police departments. They should be designated as a national safe place. But what that would mean is that if you were an adult male victim, that would also open up the options of service provision to at least get you to somewhere safe that's not a homeless shelter for the evening for whatever period of time it was needed. Okay, great. So with these organizations, one of the big problems in not already capitalizing on their existence and kind of integrating them into more of the federal protocols we have regarding human trafficking and victim service provision is that they are already contributing to the same vulnerable populations that we're seeking to help. This means that we, with a very, very little additional training and technical assistance capacity, they are able to really provide a lot of assistance to the people that we would already like to reach. And as many of them serve positions of public authority, there's not this sense of law enforcement aversion. We definitely see that with volunteer firefighters and EMTs, that people that may be hesitant to come forward to law enforcement for whatever tactics of control may have been employed upon them, that, you know, law enforcement will deport you, law enforcement will, you know, arrest you for your commercial sex acts. We've seen that volunteer firefighters are at least able to overcome some of those barriers and are seen as more community centered. Now, two things would have to change for some of these groups, and I was able on the site in the pilot programs I did to seamlessly include this into our training protocols. But the two things would be essentially to recognize indicators of human trafficking. It's a pretty basic training that you could give, lasts in a half hour to an hour, to kind of increase their capacity to recognize these problem signs, and you would tailor it to what populations each group works with. And then finally, being fluent in what are the available reporting measures and who is the appropriate person to go to. That is clearly important, because a lot of the trouble we have right now is that even though someone like a community member or somebody who is in a position to help somebody else may learn of a situation, they may not know the correct place to report that. And it's not always just local law enforcement, although that's better than nothing. Sometimes a lot of these situations require a little bit more nuance in selecting who you're going to report to. For example, if you find a foreign national victim, it's not always the most prudent solution to immediately refer them to ICE or HSI. That's just, you know. And they have wonderful, I don't want to say that, they do have a lot of training. They're very, you know, capable individuals, but some of these situations, particularly in the distinction between labor trafficking and labor exploitation, if a situation doesn't necessarily rise to the level of labor trafficking, but may have, you know, elements of exploitation, that's when you have a situation where it may be more advisable and more victim-centered to provide a legal aid referral to help that person develop a stronger case for their situation than to necessarily immediately bring them to the federal body in charge of that. So the National Court Appointed Special Advocates, we've had some great success with this program in DC. We've looked, so other than myself, we also partner with Fair Girls, who's actually giving a presentation upstairs, I think, on trafficking. And what we do is work in conjunction with the DYRS facility, which is the secured facility that many foster care youth are put into if they, you know, are convicted of truancy or any other related situation, and they need additional security that can't be provided by a group home or some other less stable situation. We find them in this program, and then we're able to do outreach and some prevention on a very basic level, just developing, like, you know, more human contacts with them, letting them know this is who we are, this is who you can talk to, and if this is happening to you, you know, we're not going to judge you, we can help you get the right help. One of the fascinating things, and something I didn't expect to encounter, was that in group homes in Washington, D.C., and I would believe that this trend would logically follow through the rest of the country, within a lot of the group homes, which are, of course, gender specific, so these are a lot of young women that are, you know, either truant or they may have, you know, they are clearly in the foster care system, what we're seeing is a lot of recruitment. So sometimes women that we would call them bottoms in the field, but those are women that have been under the control of a controller for, you know, an extended period of time, and they've started to take on characteristics or responsibilities that the controller would have otherwise assumed. So sometimes, depending on what the potential victim chooses to do, if they do take it to court, for example, if that person decides to press charges against a bottom, like a fellow woman in the situation who has exerted some level of control or exploitation over them, then that would be their purview and they would be treated as the trafficker. And that's happened many times. And that's one of the issues that we weren't aware of looking in when we first began this pilot project, that this kind of recruitment and kind of manipulative exploitation was really going on in the group homes themselves. But once we started training a lot of our court-appointed special advocates, and especially the youth, on what to look for, we were getting many, many more reports of women that were trying to enlist other, like, fellow women, fellow young girls into these situations. And to be clear, anytime a minor under the federal law, anytime someone under the age of 18 is engaging in commercial sex acts, it's considered to be trafficking, even if there's a clearly identifiable controller or not. Okay, great, and we have a great national scope. So nationally, the protocols that we put in place in DC could easily be transferred to their national network of all of these people that would then have an intimate relationship with a lot of the youth in foster care. Big Brothers, Big Sisters. So for very many of the similar reasons that the National Court Appointed Special Advocates was an effective program, this is also the same with Big Brothers, Big Sisters. One big change is that Big Brothers, Big Sisters are not sworn into a court. They don't have to go through as much specialized training. A lot of this, a lot of the pairing that goes on between Big Brothers, Big Sisters and the at-risk or vulnerable youth will happen because of personal characteristics. So that means that they may actually be able to obtain a higher level of connection to the young people in question. And that doesn't even just end with that one pairing. It also extends to the network of people that youth might be affiliated with and who may also be able to say, hey, my big might be able to assist you with this. She's aware of, she works in this, she can get you help. What we were finding was that as we were starting to train people, there was kind of a wildfire effect that people were willing to spread the word, were willing to kind of bring forward more and more referrals of people that they knew that fit some of the patterns we were talking about and might be able to obtain assistance. And it's got a national scope as well, that there are Big Brothers Big Sisters chapters in every state and at least 357 representative agencies. Now, volunteer firefighters. This is probably the most interesting, field work somebody could do. It was fascinating. I worked with the Hyattsville Volunteer Fire Department, Station 1 in Prince George's County. It was really amazing, and those guys were very supportive. They're fantastic and very interested in the situation. Now, one interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that people will sometimes call, the local fire station or the EMTs there if they have some kind of strange medical thing that they don't necessarily want to go to a hospital for, or to, as I mentioned earlier, law enforcement aversion they don't want to go to a law enforcement for. So we would have people come through the fire department on a regular basis because, they need to get a ring cut off, or they were in a domestic violence dispute and needed someplace safe to be. So, this is a great fit for the anti-trafficking field, and it really hasn't been more formally addressed. Now, the interesting thing about the volunteer firefighters is that, of course, there's a component of career firefighters as well, and there's no reason that this wouldn't be able to transfer over to them. I just mentioned volunteers because one of the themes in the groups that I reached out to were that these were all volunteer-based organizations. Now, what that means is that these people will also have professional networks. They will also have community networks that aren't just limited by these organizations. So what you're doing by training these individuals who already have taken on some additional level of responsibility in their own communities is that you're then seeing the capacity to spread that message even further and try to get more awareness and more assistance to the right people. And then EMTs. So a lot of people don't know that EMTs, once you get certified, that's not really just it. You have to get recertified every 2 years, and you have to do a certain level of recertification, continuing medical credit hours. And there are lots of opportunities to kind of meet those criteria, but to just make, so for the Prince George's County continuing medical requirements, all we had to do is create a healthcare provider assessment for human trafficking. What are the victims? And we included, of course, domestic violence in that because you will see a lot of the very similar indicators of, sexual violence, trauma, and a lot of the same bonds of relationship building and, betrayal, and also loyalty that you might see with those same situations. So by doing that, we were able to kind of meet a lot of those requirements that all of these EMTs will have to meet anyway. And to remember that volunteer firefighters and EMTs are called into private residences without necessarily the burden of reporting to law enforcement. Okay, so just because to wrap up, because I think we're running out of time. So for best practices, of course, I think including these actors or representatives of these actors and those particularly that are responsible for their training protocols in federal policy meetings are important because a lot of times what we're doing are duplicating a lot of existing efforts without even knowing that they're already there or that we have resources that are entrenched, so to speak. Now, what we were doing previously, particularly for the Department of Justice, when we were looking at how to appropriate different federal grants, we were looking at how many victims served a given organization could demonstrate, and that we perceive need based on that. Now, of course, there's so many barriers to certification alone but also to victim identification, that this seemed problematic. So something that I've been working on as well is to develop a logic of exploitation. So where are you more likely to have vulnerable people that might need these kinds of assistance, rather than where have you demonstrated need? Because at this point, because of the nature of the crime, it is very difficult to get reporting protocols to where they should be. So it's not a fully transparent process. Therefore, I think we should function on a logic of exploitation. There aren't very many expedient ways to disseminate information in our field. Of course, as many of us know, there's a paucity of academic work on, specifically domestic trafficking, but also, human trafficking in general. And if you look at some of the major books in this field, they were published 5 to 10 years ago. So what would be really important and really great would be to have kind of access to an immediate way of reaching lots of people, such as, more articles and things like The Economist on a lot of these labor trafficking crews. That would be pretty helpful for anybody that might be vulnerable to joining a labor trafficking sales or traveling sales crew and might be unaware that that's something that is, is a known trafficking network. And then there are, of course, very many successful models for human trafficking task forces and collaborations. The Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Office for Victims of Crime have done a really successful collaborative grant process. And now that that information would have been turned in for the FY 2012 year, we can then look and see what's worked and what hasn't. Field-wide coordination is pretty important. I mean, one of the issues with the emergency transportation assistance I mentioned earlier that is inherent in the labor trafficking network for the traveling sales crews is that there isn't one service provider that coordinates national resources for emergency transportation. All that might take is one database where all of the pro bono seats on Delta airline flights or Southwest Airlines that already provide these pro bono assistance, and even Greyhound bus seat tickets, having one centralized location where those availabilities are reported, and then also where we go to meet those needs. And then finally, optimization of news outlets. And for example, Univision. Having more Spanish language informational programming that kind of says, here are your rights as a H-2A visa holder. This is what you're entitled to. This is how you can avoid exploitation. These are resources you can go to. This is a number you can call, Linea de Ayuda, if you need somebody. So I think I've just about run out of time, but thank you guys for your time, and I look forward to questions.
And Professor Hanna is just going to jump in quickly. She has class at 5:30, but this is Professor Skalli-Hanna. She's in the International Development Program and has heard Davina present in a couple of different fora, I believe, and so we're really lucky to hear her perspective.
Thank you, Davina. Thank you, Tara. Thank you all for putting this symposium together. Fantastic initiative, great work, very productive. My only regret is that I have to rush through everything and not attend the rest, because the rest is really fascinating. So, Tara, could you please just 5 minutes and remind me that I need to stop talking? Thank you. So indeed, this is the third time that I've had the pleasure of hearing Tara present her work. And I know that there is a lot of depth to it, and the scope is much bigger than what we have heard. So it's really impressive. The first time I met her was in a conference at UVA on the sociology of development, where she was talking about the use of information technologies along the supply chain. Is that right? It was fascinating to discover an SIS student outside of SIS. So, and then of course, I invited her to come speak to my students in class, and she brings a wealth of knowledge that is always very useful. So what I'm trying to do in the few minutes I have, highlight some of the strengths and contributions in her research, and also, because I'm not going to be here, and I know that it's a bigger, this is just a piece of a puzzle that's much bigger, just throw in a few questions and suggestions that you can pick up on later on in the discussion. So for me, one of the important contributions of Davina's work is that she embodies what we're all about in SIS in terms of bringing the practitioner, scholar perspective to actually capture or provide some of the important solutions that can make a difference in people's lives. Trafficking is a huge, complex issue. The fact that she has experiential knowledge, the fact that she's a practitioner, she is able to identify some of the big as well as small ways in which we can make a difference. And I think that this is no small contribution, because the literature that I'm familiar with very often falls in this largely into describing the problem. And it is a vaccine problem. And it's very easy to get caught up, in numbers and the sort of discussion of vulnerabilities and the miseries of this phenomenon. And that's a scholarship that has its place, no doubt. But what is unique here is that the fact that she's a practitioner, she always had that question to answer. What can be done? And I think that what we've heard today is, beginning to answer that question of what can be done. And that's pretty much linked to the second contribution as I see it. She talks about vulnerabilities. And yes, trafficking thrives on vulnerabilities and multiple marginalities, because that's what it is. It's vulnerability of age, of socioeconomic status, but also vulnerability, poverty, being the first cause, and all sorts of things. But she does provide a sort of balanced analysis where you have, analysis of vulnerabilities as well as an analysis of assets. And what she's provided right now is mapping assets within the community. How can we mobilize what exists and build on it in order to make a contribution again? So I think that that's something fascinating that is appealing to the field, in various fields, of course, development being one of them. And if the way I understand human security, part of it is the human right, but also the aspect of dignity, trying to mobilize all of these resources to provide security, but also restore a sense of dignity to people who've been violated only because they are vulnerable. And that takes me to the third important point, and that is Davina is part of civil society that she's talking about. She's active in civil society, so she has that insider's knowledge. And to talk about civil society as those unrecognized and tapped into resources, I think that that is a very, indeed, unconventional approach to talk about unconventional actors. And somewhere in the presentation, she didn't emphasize that a lot today, but I know that media and communication technologies are huge, in your research, and I know that you have established those networks. Now, where I would like to see this going, civil society indeed is part of the solution. It's one item of the solution. Trafficking is about networks. Networks of exploitation, networks of trafficking, networks of transiting, networks of expertise, networks of communication. And civil society is one way of getting into that, countering the networks with other networks. And because we are talking about a multidimensional issue, trafficking, that requires, concentration of expertise to allow trafficking to happen, and make it the multi-billion-dollar sort of business that we know, I would like to see how civil society fits in within broader networks of solutions, broader networks of knowledge, expertise, capabilities. Put differently, I would like, and I'm sure she's doing this in her research, but she can talk more about it, how do these unconventional actors link up to conventional actors? How can we work on this, on their contributions and expertise to form partnerships? Because I don't believe that the problem of trafficking would require only one set of actors. We really need to mobilize all the resources that we have. And given your perspective, what are the serious challenges, that we know partnership is a term that everybody loves, and yet it's one of those challenging things to actually see happen in real life. It's about time. The other thing I would like to hear her address, these are issues in the U.S., resources in the U.S., experience and knowledge in the U.S. and networks. What happens when we transfer this model? outside of the U.S. Within environments where there is knowledge, there is a lot of vulnerability, but building on those resources, is costly, and who can intervene in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanna. Our next speaker is a graduate of the SIS program in IPCR, and she's done extensive work in official apologies to Indigenous communities. So, Ellie Simon, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, we'll take questions for Davina and the other two presenters at the end, so hold on to those if you have them.
All right. So I don't know if I'm tall enough to use this, actually. What?
Would you rather use it?
Sure. Okay. I'll just angle this. Should have worn my high heels. All right. Well, thank you, first of all, for the organizers for doing this for today and for everyone else who's here. I really appreciate it. So I did my SRP for International Peace and Conflict Resolution on official apologies to Indigenous communities. I did a comparative case study of Canada and Australia, and I'll be going over what I found today. So I'd like to start out my presentation today with a story about an Indigenous woman born in the late 1920s. She lived with her family in a bush camp just outside Tennant Creek, Australia, until she was about 4 years old, when the welfare man came. She was taken away immediately, without a chance to say goodbye to her family or given a reason for being taken. All of the children in her community were sent to religious missions, workstations, orphanages, and government institutions throughout the country, far from their homes and often separated from their siblings and friends who had also been stolen. Children were beaten and punished for exhibiting any behaviors that were related to their Indigenous background, whether it be speaking their language, wearing Indigenous clothes, or asking about their families and homes. They were told to forget everything about their former lives. Years later, as an adult, this woman left the mission she had stayed at and sought out her family. But she soon found out that her mother had died years before, a broken woman fretting for the children that had literally been ripped away from her. Sadly, this is a true story, and it does not belong to this one woman alone, but in fact belongs to hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who experience similar stories throughout Australia as well as Canada, and to their families, friends, communities, and loved ones who were devastated by the loss of their children. So just to give you a bit of a historical background, the practice of legally kidnapping Indigenous children from their homes and placing them in non-Indigenous homes and institutions in Canada and Australia occurred for over a century, in the 19th and 20th centuries. Australia's Aborigines Act of 1905 made this practice into law. It declared Indigenous children legal wards of the state and enabled any Aboriginal or half-caste child to be sent to and detained in an institution, industrial school, or orphanage. This became a common phenomenon by the mid-20th century, and these children later became known as the stolen generations. Similarly, in Canada, the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 aimed to systematically assimilate Indigenous people through various tactics, but mainly through forcibly removing children from their families and placing them in Indian residential schools, commonly known as IRS. They were given no guarantee of returning home, and by 1920, attendance at IRS became compulsory. The living conditions for both the stolen generations and the IRS students were appalling. Children were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused and severely punished for demonstrating any connection to their Indigenous roots. Institutions in Australia were compared to concentration camps because the children were regimented and locked up like caged animals. Conditions in Canada were so poor that there was an estimated 50% death rate among the students. These practices remained legal in Australia until 1969, when the laws were finally abolished. However, the practice was not completely discontinued until the late 1970s. In Canada, there were still 12 residential schools operating in 1979 with about 1,900 students. The last school was not closed until 1996. Although the numbers are somewhat disputed, it is generally believed that over 100,000 Indigenous Australian children were removed from their homes between 1910 and 1970. Suggesting that in all, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were taken from their homes at the height of this practice. With a current population of about 300,000, nearly every person in the Australian Indigenous community has felt the effects of this policy. In Canada, an estimated 100 to 160,000 Indigenous children attended IRS. Of the current Indigenous population of over 1 million, there are 90,000 surviving students. In practical terms, this means that as many as 9 out of every 10 Native people know someone who went to a residential school. In both Canada and Australia, the Indigenous communities continue to be the poorest, most disadvantaged groups. High levels of alcoholism and suicide among Indigenous people are often attributed to the abuse leveled against the stolen generations and IRS students. 5 years ago, in 2008, the heads of state of both Canada and Australia independently offered official apology statements to Indigenous people affected by these policies for the damage that they caused. Because these apologies were given just months apart from each other and focused on similar topics, I decided this would be an interesting opportunity to compare and contrast the two cases and gather evidence about the apologies' motivations, content, and impacts 4 to 5 years after they took place. I hope that this would lead me to some conclusions about the usefulness or futility of official apologies from this data. Now, in examining what motivated and led up to the apologies in Canada and Australia, I found a similar pattern in the sequence of events between the two countries. The path to these apologies lasted for decades in both cases. The survivors of the stolen generations and IRS began speaking up publicly about their stories of abuse in the 1980s and 1990s. Although these policies were in place for over a decade, few non-Indigenous Canadians and Australians didn't know about them until after they had already ended. So this new awareness led to national inquiries into the situations, leading to formal publications on findings on the stolen generations and Indian residential schools. They were published in 1996 and 1997. The report's findings were so shocking and so widely read that each government was forced to respond in some way. In 1997, the Canadian Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs in Canada offered a statement of reconciliation on Parliament Hill during a lunch hour ceremony. However, the Prime Minister at the time was notably absent from the ceremony, and many felt that the speech lacked sincerity and substance. In Australia, Prime Minister John Howard refused to offer an official apology because he believed that, quote, Australians of this generation should not be required to accept guilt and blame for past actions and policies, unquote. But upon further public pressure, he eventually issued a statement of regret in 1999. Now, these initial apologies did not satisfy those calling for justice. In the 1990s, IRS survivors began filing lawsuits against the government, and by 2001, this totaled more than 8,500 lawsuits. It was predicted that this could double within a decade. These lawsuits were eventually consolidated into a class action suit that was settled in 2007. The IRS settlement agreement, which is shortened for IRSSA, included provisions for compensation towards former students, as well as a 5-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document the school's legacy. In Australia, the lack of an official apology prompted grassroots action in the form of protests and organizing. A National Sorry Day was established to show support for the stolen generations, as well as to call for a governmental apology. Over 1 million people attended the first National Sorry Day in 1998, and the day has been commemorated widely every year since. This widespread public support led to an Australian Labor Party candidate for Prime Minister named Kevin Rudd, promising to give an official apology if elected. Months later, he won the 2007 federal election by a large margin. As one of his major first actions, Rudd delivered an apology speech on February 13, 2008. Once the Australian apology had been given, this put extreme pressure on the Canadian government to follow suit. Several days after the Canadian TRC was launched, as part of the IRSSA, Prime Minister Harper offered an official apology on June 11, 2008, in front of a sitting parliament. Now, in order to analyze the content of Prime Minister Rudd's and Harper's apologies, I needed to identify a framework in order to compare the two speeches. I decided to use a definition for a political apology created by Jana Thompson, which was published in The Age of Apology, Facing Up to the Past. Thompson's definition is as follows. Anyone offering an apology should convey to the victims that 1, she acknowledges that she has committed a wrongful act against the victim and takes responsibility for it. 2, he feels remorse for his deed. And 3, she undertakes to avoid similar transgressions against the victim in the future. I felt this was the most holistic definition that I could find for an apology, but I also felt that there was one main ingredient that was still missing. So for the purposes of this study, I added one fourth point, which was that he commits to repairing the damage incurred from the offense. So these 4 points is how I analyzed the 2 apology speeches against each other. Now, on the first point, both speeches acknowledged that a wrongful act had been committed and they took responsibility for it, but the language in Rudd's speech was much stronger. Here are 2 excerpts from Harper's speech that meet this qualification. Now, this first excerpt can be interpreted as acknowledging the wrongful act, while this second one shows that he claims responsibility for it. So he basically meets the qualification, but he doesn't necessarily go over and beyond in any way. In contrast to this, the Australian apology, Rudd's speech was much more intense than Harper's. He went further by saying the following. Here, Rudd not only expressed that this act was wrong and he took responsibility for it, but in the second excerpt here, he actually goes over and beyond and explicitly outlined why the government was responsible for apologizing. And in doing so, he preemptively countered those who would argue otherwise. On the definition's second point, Rudd's speech was much more intense once again. At the start, he stated this: "For the pain, suffering, and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind, we say sorry." This acknowledged both the pain and victims as well as their families and descendants. Describing what they went through, he conveyed an urgency and intensity lacking in Harper's speech. He used terms like searing pain, sheer brutality, and deep assault. He also recounted a personal story of the stolen generations. He described the unimaginable instance of being taken from one's family. This vivid, disturbing scenario allowed the listeners to imagine themselves in a similar situation. By telling this story, Rudd actually allowed others to experience remorse while reminding them that there were thousands of comparable stories as well. Now, in contrast to this, Harper opened his speech in this way. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. While sad can allude to a feeling of remorse, he only uses about the treatment of children and not about the whole practice. He also fell short later in the speech. He said that while some former students have spoken positively about their experiences, and then he went on from there. This sort of almost qualified the practice instead of apologizing for it, making it somewhat of a partial apology. And finally, he said that in the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligation to educate Aboriginal children, and went on from there once again. Again, this is sort of him explaining the causes of why the practice happened instead of taking full responsibility and apologizing for them. So on the third point, both Harper and Rudd met their qualification, but again, Rudd's words were a bit stronger, saying that he resolved the injustices must never happen again, while Harper just said that the attitudes behind the actions won't prevail. And on the final point, on repairing damage from the offense, Rudd said that it's not sentiment that makes history, it's our actions that make history. And then he went on to outline a very full plan of action that he went on to implement afterwards about how to close the gaps between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous communities in Australia. Harper, on the other hand, talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had already been launched, but he didn't really talk about the differences in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities or what else the government was going to do in order to address these needs. So in terms of the initial outcomes and reactions to the apology, Australia celebrated the 4th anniversary last February, and many people who responded about the apology was a very positive sense of relief. These are some quotes that I found from news articles at the time, from Indigenous leaders and Indigenous community members. They talked about how there's hope for the future now, and it's just such a relief for someone to actually acknowledge what had happened. In Canada, it's a pretty different story. Unfortunately, a lot of the actions that had taken place so far show that nothing really has changed. In some ways, things are worse for Indigenous people now than they were back when the IRS was taking place. People complain about the living conditions and the fact that the government is really doing nothing about these things. They also talk about the fact that they feel that the last 4 years have just been a waste of time and nothing has really been done since then. Now, Australia really focused again on closing that gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. If you look at the statistics here, basically on each of these 4 points, Indigenous people are better off now than they were before the apology. However, you have to realize that for some of them, the statistics have also improved for non-Indigenous people in Australia. And so, especially for infant mortality rates and high school graduates, their relative inequality is still very great. However, it's still progress, and it shows that something good is happening. In Canada, the TRC has not had a great start. It started about 9 months late because of infighting among the leadership. They also continue to operate under a narrow mandate, and this often excludes many of the former students from the process altogether. There's also a rule that the TRC report cannot actually identify perpetrators, which to many survivors makes them feel like the report is just going to be a whitewash if they can't actually identify the violent actions that were done to them. There's also been cuts on Indigenous health funding, and oftentimes the TRC is used as a public forum to complain about these things instead of for what it was made up to be. So this slows down the process considerably. And finally, the compensation process has been very problematic. A lot of people were not able to get the compensation that they deserved, and this has led to a lot of frustration among Canadian Australians. So in terms of the summary of my outcomes, first, I found that while politics was a major motivation in the case of both apologies, it acted as a positive incentive for Rudd, yet a negative threat for Harper. So making the apology was Rudd's own choosing. He did it based on his own free will, whereas for Harper, he basically did it because he would be committing political suicide if he didn't do it. People sort of forced him to do it instead of from his own choosing. And I found that because of this, it might have affected the way that the apologies were made and also what happened after the apologies. Again, both of these apologies met the qualifications for the definition of a political apology, but Rudd met these qualifications to a much greater and deeper level than Harper did. I found that initial outcomes of and reactions to these apologies also had serious differences. I think I talked about that earlier. And finally, it can be assumed that these differences stem from the issue of ownership. So what I found in the end was that more than anything, because the apology was sort of forced on the Canadian government instead of them taking ownership of it, the results were seriously faltered. And basically, until the Canadian population puts enough pressure on their government to take this issue seriously, the results will probably continue to falter. So just to wrap it up in conclusion, in both cases, saying sorry is important, but only a beginning step. Reconciliation efforts must be multifaceted and holistic, just as the damage on people's lives has been multifaceted and intrusive. Reconciliation must address the economic, social, political, cultural, physical, and emotional damage, as well as the damage that impacts institutions. Every apology must be understood only as the beginning of many steps to be taken persistently and thoughtfully over time.
And as a part Canadian, we'll have plenty to talk about Harper later. And our final panelist is a second-year EPGA student studying land grabs in Argentina. So Jason Meisner, come on up.
Okay, first, I would like to thank the JIS and GSC for putting so much time and effort into putting on this panel. We really do appreciate it. And to the panelists that came and the audience members as well. So what I focused on, what my research looked at was particularly this global phenomenon known as land grabs, and in particular movements resisting these land grabs. So first, I'll briefly go over the scale where it's happening and some of the impacts of these land grabs. I wish I could spend so much more time on these, discussing the land grabs, but I really want to get to my research. A plug for the Woodrow Wilson Center. They just put out a book called The Global Farms Race, edited by Michael Kugelman and Sarah Levenstein. So I encourage you all to buy it, read it, and share it. Next, I'll focus on my research. I'll look at my research question, particularly describing what's happening with soy production in Argentina, and then Mocase, this Movimiento Campesino de Santiago del Estero, a peasant movement of Santiago del Estero, which is the province it is located in, some of the laws they use to resist, and these two concepts known as Reforma Agraria Integral, integrated agrarian reform, as well as Soberania Alimentaria, this concept of food sovereignty. And then I'll part with some concluding remarks. So what is a land grab? It's a very ambiguous kind of catch-all term that basically has been used to describe national and transnational companies as well as governments buying and leasing land across the world in the past number of years. While the land grab is maybe not the most analytically sharp term, it does reveal the unequal power relations that are happening in a lot of these land acquisitions. So on a global scale, this graph provided by the International Land Coalition shows the scale and pace of land grabs happening around the world. The difference between the white and yellow bars is the cross-referencing of media reports, because not all the media reports have been as accurate. And as you can see, there's just been a huge increase in the pace and scale in the last number of years. Some of the higher estimates by Oxfam put the number at 227 million hectares have come under contract in the past 10 years. To give you an idea, a hectare is about almost 2.5 acres, and the average size of a small family farm is about 2 hectares. So where is it? Excuse me. So where is it happening? It's this graph plots the media reports provided by Grain, and the darker the red, the more land has been grabbed. And it's not just this global north to global south phenomenon. It's definitely this global south to south land grabs occurring, and it's also occurring interregionally as well as intra-regionally. And some of these contracts have leasing agreements that are from 20 years to 99 years, and some of the land grabbed was on scale from 10,000 hectares, 50,000 hectares, and in some parts of Africa in the millions. So what are the main drivers? I'm really going to have to breeze through this, but I'd love to talk with you afterwards if you're more interested. One is the food crisis in 2008, the food price spikes. Also, with climate change, the rise in carbon markets, and the energy crisis with the spike in oil in 2000, spike in oil prices in 2008. You also see with the meatification of diets, a lot of feed being grown for cattle and other livestock. And you also see public mandates like for example, the US and UK, where 5% of their energy consumption by 2020 is mandated to come from biofuels. You also have seen what Philip McMichael, a professor at Cornell, calls the financialization of agriculture. And while a lot of these land grabs are for land, it's also very much for water and other resources derived from benefits from controlling the land. So this graph on the very left shows the global land grabs by sector. With the food crisis, we would traditionally think that most of these grabs are going towards food production, but in fact, some of the cross-reference data shows that more than a third are going towards biofuels. So why are people resisting these grabs? One is I'll focus on the negative impacts. One is a lot of the crops being produced are being exported. And so you'll have regions where people are facing hunger and food aid is coming in. But in fact, you will also have food leaving, going back to the host government or host country. It also, however, there are many nuances. For example, the work by Professor Boedicker, who used to be at SIS and now is at SAIS. Some of her research looked into the Chinese firms with these investments in agriculture, and a lot of the Chinese firms have been siphoning off or diverting some of the export food for the local population. One other negative impact is it further disadvantages women. About 80% of women participate about 80% of agriculture in the world, but only own 2 to 3% of the land, because the land titles are usually in the male head of household's name. With the land deforested, it decreases the supply of food for the family. A lot of women gather food or firewood and other medicines from the forest. And also another negative impact is the land tenure and displacement. So a lot of the people live in precarious land tenure situations where they might be living on the land for generations but don't necessarily have formal titles to the land. And it's so therefore the government usually owns it. And a lot of the land is deemed marginal or underutilized when in fact the communities use it for grazing or for collecting medicine, as I mentioned earlier. So you see a lot of these grabs buying and leasing land where people are living on, so displacing large amounts of people and communities. Some of the other effects are land use change. So you might have land that was dedicated to forest or other traditional food crops now being used for, now being deforested and used for export crop production. And with a lot of these land grabs, it's large in scale, which and all the biofuels require large amounts of water. And so you're seeing depletion of water aquifers as well as soil, the risk of soil degradation. And you're seeing large areas becoming deforested, particularly in South America, in Argentina, and Brazil. And with these land grabs, it's largely based on the investor focusing on one or two crops. So you see large amounts of monoculture, so what results is a loss of biodiversity. So next, what's happening in Argentina? The top graph gives you a breakdown by the country of origin of the foreign investor. In Argentina, you see Saudi Arabia, China, Denmark, and the US involved in Argentina. And the bottom graph is the breakdown by sector. So you see the traditional agribusiness firms, but you also see finance capital getting involved in Argentina. So in the province I traveled to, in Santiago del Estero, you see three forms of land grabbing happening. One is mining, another is cattle production, and the third one is soy production. So really briefly, this one graph provided by the Food and Agricultural Organization shows just the proliferation of soy in South America in the past 5 decades. One reason why why there's so much soy production in Argentina is the convergence of government policies, introduction of Monsanto's genetically modified Roundup Ready soy, along with capital-intensive large technology, the pesticides, herbicides, as in the province of Santiago del Estero, the lower land prices. So usually you would see soy production in the lower Pampas regions, but now investors are going and buying up these lands in the province I traveled to. So what my research looked at is how does land grabbing happen in the local context, but in particular more how Mokase resists these land grabs, what strategies they put into action, why they put these strategies rather than others, and whether they're using the dominant framework, namely the laws and judicial system, to fight these land grabs, or are they challenging the whole framework itself? So I'll briefly mention this concept of food sovereignty, soberanía alimentaria, as a way of recognizing the economic and political dimensions of the food system. And I'll unpack what that means a little bit later. So when I went to the province, I conducted formal and informal semi-structured interviews, as well as collecting a lot of books and magazines, and I used a discourse analysis to unpack some of the word data that I collected. So I went this December and January, convincing my family that I would miss the holidays to spend the summer in Argentina. So I was in Buenos Aires for a couple weeks, talking with some of the members of Mokase, as well as its national affiliate. And then I traveled to this town called Kimberley, and from there, went out to different community members' houses, some by truck, also by horse and carriage, which I was pretty awful at maneuvering. Luckily, someone was there to take me around. So what are some of the ways Mokase resists? Is one, some of the laws that are in the books is this Ley 20 Añal, this 20-year law that basically says if you've been living on the land uninterrupted for the past 20 years and it's government-owned land, it's rightfully yours. Before Mokase started, which was in 1990, people didn't know about this law. So once they started becoming informed about it, they started mobilizing and organizing with other organizations to defend their rights and dignity, as also to fight for the land. Another one is this forest law, which basically stipulates land use policy, what land can be deforested or not. So while I was there one day working in the cheese factory and talking with some of the members, we heard about this bulldozer in the community, deforesting a lot of the land. So we jumped on some motorbikes and we rode out there to see what was going on. I'll talk while this clip, some of the footage I caught. Basically, we asked the driver if he had permission to be deforesting the land. He said he had permission, but he didn't necessarily have the papers. So of course, the Mokase members were a bit skeptical, so they contacted someone else in the town who drove out to the provincial capital to get Bosque, the Forest Administrative Service, to come observe what was going on. And it turned out this bulldozer company, hired by an agribusiness firm from a neighboring province, was in fact illegally deforesting the land, and it turned out to be an infraction on the company. The reason I spend so much time on this is how land grabbing, the forms of land grabbing on the ground. The land is deforested legally or illegally. Community members' livestock are killed. The forest or other land is set on fire, and there's also been acts of intimidation on campesinos. And so once you lose your livestock, once you lose the land you've been living and growing your food on, you lose your livelihood. So in effect, you have to move to the city. So you've seen a large migration of people moving from the rural parts to urban areas. These last two laws, briefly to talk about communal property rights as well as the moratorium on land grabs in Argentina. So one of the two broader strategies that Mocase uses is this Reforma Agraria Integral, which is this integrated agrarian reform, which is basically saying there needs to be a radical shift in the agricultural model in Argentina, and it needs to include the participation and organization of community members. And that some of what I was reading is about people's identity was tied to the land, and the part of this integrated agrarian reform was restoring and recovering the people's local knowledge-based systems of how to use the land in the agricultural model, and then not necessarily just to focus on land as an economic commodity, but realize the social function of land and water. And while they advocated for land redistribution, because Argentina is actually one of the only Latin American countries, if the only one, that has never had extensive agrarian reform. And some fresh data that came out last month by the Canadian Development Journal showed that there's been an increase in farm size and land concentration in Argentina. So what they're calling for is land distribution, but just because you have just because your land is on small scale does not necessarily mean you know how to farm. So it's very much a part of educating people on how to farm. And their affiliate, another movement in Brazil known as the Landless Workers Movement, MST, says it's not only a fight for land, but a fight on the land, which includes educating people on this concept of agroecology, which is an agricultural model that relies less on external inputs and more on integrating the ecological and social system into this farming model. And it's also about providing local credits and access to local credits for small-scale farmers. And so this integrated agrarian reform is the way to get to this concept of food sovereignty, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actively naming what they see is wrong in the food system. And it's not just about food security, namely having food at all times for a healthy lifestyle, but it's about where the food is produced, how it is produced, who produces it, how it is distributed, and how do people have access to it. So the concept I was looking at works on two levels. One, discursively, as I mentioned, naming and shaming what they see as wrong, and particularly this corporate control of the food system. In Argentina, the soybean oil export is it's about $4.9 billion, and it's dominated. 80% of it is dominated by 5 companies. So it's talking about decentralizing this concept of food sovereignty. So it's embedded in agroecology and the cooperation of labor on the ground. And it's also about democratizing land and water, so people have more say in how their land in their surrounding communities, the land on the surrounding communities is used. And while this food sovereignty isn't a concept created by Mocase, it's a concept by its global affiliate, the Livia Campesina, this global peasant movement. But so these different movements use it, and they definitely use it a lot. It's in the different small processing plants located in the community. But it's this global platform for the different struggles that are going on. And it's what others have said, it's a kind of unity through diversity. So in the literature that I was reading that they published, they talk about how the quebracho tree located in the areas is used for medicinal purposes. So if you deforest it, you're moving a lot of the health benefits that they derive from the forest. And the second way food sovereignty is used is in action. So in effect, building this new food system that places the community's values back into the system. So you have the small processing plant, the Fabrica, the middle picture, that's located in Buenos Aires, and you also have the different products produced by other affiliate movements in the region, trying to prove that small-scale agriculture can feed the world. And I know my time is up, so I'll just briefly conclude that what do these social movements provide? One is La Via Campesina is so radical that, in effect, so radical and criticizes the World Trade Organization that, in effect, allows policy space for other civil society actors and NGOs to critique the WTO. At the very most, it provides a whole new type of alternative development model where the peasant isn't, the campesino isn't something of the past, but something of the modern. And if you think, draw this concept of food sovereignty out, the states have a duty to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So if the food sovereignty is a human right, states will have to, in effect, subordinate trade relations, or at least make sure they comply in order to recognize this concept of food sovereignty with this local autonomy of small-scale producers. So I'll end there. All right, thank you very much.
So we could have our panelists and presenters up here for a brief Q&A session, and we'll open the floor to Professor Shepler and Professor Graddy to give some comments on the presentations, and then we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate. This has been wonderful so far, and I hope the rest of the day is as wonderful. I want to start with a brief anecdote related to Ellie's paper. You shouldn't believe your professors. Because I remember when I was in graduate school taking a class on education, and one of the students in the seminar talked about this phenomenon of stolen generations, and the professor denied that such a thing had ever happened. Wow. And the students all had to bring in evidence the next meeting and say, this is a real thing. So thank you I'm glad that people know more now than when I was in graduate school. I wanted to talk a little bit about the connection to our theme of human security. And I want to make a plug for peace studies as a field of endeavor that has long been thinking about human security in perhaps different ways. That is, we've long had a broad conception of what peace means, to include things like structural violence, poverty, gender inequality, and I think more recently things like health and food as part of what we consider peace studies. And human security is a way of almost securitizing what people have been thinking about as social justice in the past. So I'm interested in tracing those kind of moves. I have maybe 4 or 5 comments for Ellie. First of all, I think it's interesting that when we think about human security, education provision is often a piece of that. I mean, that's one thing that's measured in the Human Development Index, for example, primary enrollment rates. And yet, in your case, it was very interesting that it was exactly educational institutions that were the institutions of the deculturation, the institutions of the cultural violence that you're talking about. Secondly, I think it's interesting that this insecurity came from the state, right? That we need to think about state actors in human security. I think it's also interesting to think about, is justice an element of human security? Maybe this is part of kind of a peace studies approach to this as well. But if we ask what does it take for humans to be secure, is part of what they need justice for past wrongdoings. Finally, just about your research, I hadn't read it before, even though you did take my qualitative methods class, so I was very pleased to see a very nice research methodology and your use of content analysis and use of some statistics as well. So I thought, oh, very nice research design. But I wanted to get to your point about the definition that you used of apology, and then at the end you measured what was the impact. And I think that it's easier to find the impact of the fourth element of your definition, that is repair. Right? What money was spent to actually try to repair some of these damages. It's much harder to find the impact of the first three elements of the apology. Was it sincere? Did people really feel bad that they had done wrong? And I wonder if you thought about ways one might measure the impact. Because at the end, you do want to come down on a decision of, was the apology important or not, right? And not just, were the programs put in place to try to repair the damage effective or not, right? And one of your conclusions is about whether the different populations took ownership of the apology. I don't know how you would measure how much that ownership had an impact. So that's kind of my last question to you, and thank you again.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks to the organizers. First, I wanted to say the three of you have selected topics that are at the extremes of injustice, and so I just wanted to commend you for bravely and boldly tackling trauma, historic and contemporary trauma, and the conditions for future trauma. I think it's School of International Service becomes a cliche, but the reality is that that's our premise, is that scholarship can document injustice and then pave the way for thinking about rectifying that and changing those conditions. So I'll begin with Jason, since I've been working with Jason since last spring. And this project began last spring, him thinking about land grabs, which is a timely and extremely complicated subject. And not only did Jason dive into it, but he's laid out all last summer and last fall during the seminar that we worked together on, and then in original qualitative research this winter, has put together a dissertation's worth of knowledge into a master's thesis. So I have no idea how you're going to pack all that into a master's thesis, but I commend you for that. So in his work, he's laid out what's unique about land grabs is that they bring together the agrarian questions of the 20th century. So long-standing, a century's worth of scholarship on how peasants and agrarian and small-scale communities navigate post-colonial and even colonial injustices in political economies. But land grabs are uniquely 21st century. So they're the convergence of pretty much all the major 21st century challenges of our time. So we've got here financialization and speculation, the rise of speculative markets in the food system, agrofuels and the boom in agrofuels and as a mandate and as a quota, and then as that plays out with land tenure, technology, the most cutting edge agricultural technology and that's effects, agrobiotechnology, the rise of meat as a diet, climate change, carbon offset markets. So all of this converged. It was extraordinarily complicated, and Jason's been tackling that effectively and thoroughly. And then you've layered in resistance to that, which is a whole other topic, but you've done that very well. And so he worked with, he traveled to urban and rural Argentina and was thinking about the Mocase initiatives and grassroots organizations and organizing around land grab resistance, not just on a local level, on a place-based level, and thinking about the specific peculiarities of Argentina's lack of agrarian reform. It's unique in the region and the continent for that, and longstanding history of political oppression and government oppression of political mobilizations, which is very raw and recent in Argentina. There's a boldness even to speaking out against the government still to this day, with how Mocase is deeply integrated with the landless peasant movement in Brazil and the global network of Livia Campesina. There's a whole social movement analysis, which is complicated. And I look forward, when I read the paper, you thinking through how organization works in a place-based local level, but also in a very globalized, very mediated regional and global network level as well. So the food sovereignty movement is misunderstood oftentimes in scholarship and in policy because it's so radical and launches a critique against patriarchy and racism and colonialism as well as land tenure. And so it's hard to even take seriously as a scholar, as a policymaker, even though we can't ignore it. It has global purchase, and there's millions of people who are identifying as food sovereignty advocates, so we have to grapple with it as scholars. So on their own terms, and then contextualizing the movement. So you've aimed for a lot, and I'm trying to figure out how you're all going to keep it all hanging together, but it's good. So I look forward to reading that. And then with Davina's work, I just wanted to say very compelling, interesting, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts on the bringing human trafficking in the U.S. context to public consciousness. If you're not a scholar or an advocate of human trafficking, it might seem shocking that the U.S. would have this problem. It's really off the radar. In my own research in ag labor, there's been 6 cases of human trafficking in Immokalee, Florida, very recently. And so the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and some other groups are bringing to light modern-day slavery in the fields and that fine line between labor exploitation and outright slavery, outright human trafficking. So I would like to talk to you further about how public knowledge and public consciousness and how the public and the political economy is implicated in the conditions that lead to labor exploitation to the point of trafficking. And then Elisheva, is that how you pronounce it? I wanted to talk to you either in this panel or beyond about the Idle No More campaign and the current mobilization against Prime Minister Harper, but also, again, within a global context of those grassroots groups fighting for a federal policy intervention by social media and connecting to Indigenous rights mobilizations all around the continent and the hemisphere and beyond, and that leveraging of intervening at the national policy level by grassroots struggle broadly connected. So it's playing with scale of reference that gets back to Professor Bosco's very thoughtful opening remarks. I don't know if he's still here, but I'm still kind of grappling with what he was saying. It was very astute. That international relations and international studies has historically been thought of at the national scale of reference, with nations working with each other nations and the realists. And now even kind of a standard IR theory has got to think through interstate and intrastate networks that are not even focused on the national scale of reference primarily, that are thinking about change, intervention, on the community level, maybe on an epistemological level, as well as UN changes or changes to existing trade agreements. So thinking around and through the nation-state scale of reference from the scholarly and from the policy standpoint. Anyway, that's lots of ideas, but thank you all.
And I didn't know that we could talk about the other people, so I'm going to claim time to just make one more point, if I may, about Davina's work. One thing that I wanted to talk to you about or ask about, I thought it was very interesting, the lines throughout between victim and not victim, right? And so one in particular was age. There were points where it was very clear that 18 was the cutoff, and if you were under 18, you were automatically a victim, and otherwise not. You talked about I forget what you call them, bottoms, people who are both victims and perpetrators of trafficking. So where does the line exist for them? You also talked about people who are engaged in sex work but who weren't trafficked, kind of normal sex workers, and how, well, they were adults and so they're just engaged in this, transaction. So there's a line there about who's a victim and who's not a victim. And I found that kind of fascinating and worthy of more explanation about how are those lines constructed, how do they shift with time and with audience. That's all. Thank you.
I guess maybe I'll just start responding to a few questions. Thank you everyone for your time and your presentations. They're fascinating. So I guess I'll start with the questions that Professor Skalli-Hanna left us with. She mentioned, and again, thank you all for being so understanding, the brevity of our presentations really did preclude a lot of the information that would have been very instrumental, I think, to kind of filling out our discussion. But partnerships, what was inhibiting partnerships with civil society up until this point? Now that was fundamental in my choosing voluntary associations because now the partnerships, to talk about the field at large, particularly in domestic context, one of the problems with service providers is that they're essentially in a funding grab, you could say. They are in constant competition with one another for limited federal funding, and that kind of goes towards organizations that are even more established in the field. So as you find service providers that may find a niche role to fill, they may be inhibited from obtaining federal funding because there are more prominent organizations that might be able to obtain that leadership and that capital, I guess, that social and political capital to obtain that money. And partly addressing why the voluntary associations are so important is because they are not necessarily detracting from any public funding currently. They are generally organizations that exist purely through the donation of the membership's time. So that's something that we can kind of look forward to as a potential stakeholder in the field that doesn't have a conflict of interest as many others might. Now, the U.S. is relevant to international relations. I get asked this question all the time, and some of the research I wasn't able to go into was my work on technology and John boards and how demand kind of plays into it, which is a very insightful point you raised, Professor, so we'll talk about that. But something about this is that clearly this work is very entrenched. Like, these organizations were selected because, of course, I knew the most about our own country, about, well, my own country, our own country, but where, you know, we live, where we work, and where we see the real repercussions and the specific vulnerabilities. So that kind of goes back to the question you just raised, which I think is a very good segue before I get to your question, Professor. One thing I wasn't able to do, and something I usually like doing when I present on human trafficking, is to give a general baseline of how it's defined under federal policy and also how I define it in my scholarship. There's something called the Action, Means, and Purpose model that's used by the federal government and also the Polaris Project. And what that means is that if somebody is obtained, there's a whole bunch of things that would qualify, but essentially if someone is coerced or defrauded into providing commercial sex or labor and services, that's when, against their will, that's when they're considered to be a human trafficking victim. So that's kind of where we would make the distinction between women, adult women engaging in sex work, who are willingly doing that because they weren't defrauded or coerced into providing the commercial sex acts, and there may not be a controller present. Now, the reason for the age, the 18 years of age, that's like a federal policy thing. That's part of the TVPA. It's been there since its inception. But it's essentially to protect minors engaging in commercial sex acts with the idea that they may not be able to consent to those sex acts. Of course, that does vary by state. So it is largely problematic when we're looking at a lot of the relationships that may, a lot of the recruitment tactics involve romantic relationships. So that gets to be very interesting questions of who is a victim, and ultimately it comes down to self-identification, which is why empowering the victims or the vulnerable populations to identify these signs is so important. Because, for example, with the bottoms, it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to move forward in prosecuting anybody unless there's complicity with law enforcement investigation. So that's where I mentioned before that, you know, if you're a potential victim and, you know, you have, there was a former victim who's now taken on the role of a controller, it would be up to that potential victim to decide if they were going to charge that person as a controller or not. But that's generally what we've seen at this point. But I do thank you for raising that question because it is so difficult to know kind of where the baseline might be. And then finally, thank you so much for your question about responsibility and awareness. So now there have been, now to me, maybe these strides in the field seem a lot more significant than they might be. But Katie Kirk has been recently airing the hotline number pretty often. We get lots of calls at all times about this. And we just launched a texting program at the national hotline. So if anyone was to text Be Free, like BE Free, you can reach our hotline and we can give you assistance over the phone. Any informational calls, generally are put, see our website. But if you needed, you needed help reporting your situation, you needed law enforcement assistance, you needed specific referrals in your area, while it might be necessary for us to speak to you further about the situation, if you needed a referral for shelter in your area, we would try to get that to you via text, which is really new and kind of big, so we're excited about it. Now, awareness,
and,
the
in the interest of time, I just want to.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So, Jason and Ellie, if you'd like to respond quickly to some of the questions, thank you. Jason, go ahead.
I don't know if there's any questions. Did you want?
I have more questions to ask you later, but in general, I commend.
Yeah, I think both of you made interesting points. I definitely thought about that, about how to actually measure whether people thought this was sincere or not, and there was really no easy way I could do that, especially from across the world. But yeah, I did try to use those newspaper articles and pull people's initial reactions to the apology to see were there statements about people's sense of whether it was a genuine apology or not, and just tried to look for trends. So it's not a super scientific way, but I think that was definitely if I had more time and more availability to travel, I think that would have been a really interesting extra piece to look at. And yeah, I had heard more about the Idle No More campaigns going on in Canada, and there's also hunger strikes going on, which have been really new and interesting. And I think that there's like more momentum starting to build. I guess I don't know too much about it, but I do wonder if there's a certain level of a tipping point that they need to reach before this becomes something so major that the government needs to respond. You know, whereas 1 million people showed up for this National Sorry Day in Australia, can you get something so big and momentous in Canada going that something has to happen in response? So I'll be interested to see what happens from that.
Thank you, Ellie. I just want to open up the floor to some questions. We don't have too much time, but maybe one or two. All right. Well, Ellie. Oh,
my question is for Jason Meisner. How would you respond? You know, a lot of the land grabs seem to be, as described in your research, being performed by large corporate conglomerates. And how would you respond to somebody who would say their method of agricultural has a larger agricultural output in terms of like yield per hectare, as opposed to the kind of agricultural that's being undertaken by campesinos that are part of a sort of food sovereignty group, and especially in light of the fact, especially in light of concerns regarding starvation and food scarcity and high food prices across the world.
Okay, thank you. This is what you call older siblings beating up on their younger ones. This is my older brother Luke. But no, that's a fair and very valid question. One, I guess, different ways to tackle it. The world produces enough food right now to feed the entire population. The reason why hunger exists is largely due to inequitable distribution, due to poverty and inequality. In terms of I would challenge the definition of efficiency. So on a large scale, you can produce a large volume of food at a low price for the market, but it doesn't incorporate the external negative externalities and a lot of the land degradation that happens with the large-scale industrial farming. And the small-scale agriculture, while not some studies show that it does produce high yields, it doesn't just produce high yields in one crop, but a polyculture, a variety of crops. And there's actually been there's this international assessment on agricultural science and technology, which is this huge study spanning 6 years that has signed by 54 governments that basically is a consensus among scientists, NGOs, and intergovernmental bodies saying there needs to be more focus on more science and more research focused on small scale producers. Because in the past, since 1980, a lot of government support for small scale farming has diminished, and it's largely states have been largely facilitating opening up for large scale industrial farming. I guess that's the question of the day. Well, can small scale farming feed the world? I would challenge the question itself, though. Can industrial farming actually feed the world with the extreme environmental harm that it's causing? So I'd encourage more research, more analysis into small scale farming in the local communities, into whether that can feed the world.
Plus, that boom is in large part going to agrofuels, which is interesting, which are not edible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Otherwise, I'm going to ask mine. So I have one for Ellie, and Ellie, I don't know if we've addressed this yet, but especially in Canada, as a part-time Canadian, there's a lot of discussion about Indigenous rights, especially in contrast to the United States. It's such a bigger issue in Canada, and I was wondering that although the Harper regime has been reluctant to take any action on it, have you seen the issue of Indigenous rights be an impetus to oppositional parties? And if so, is it a platform for change in governance? And so, My question is, do we see this issue of human security and indigenous rights and apologies come to the political scene?
So are you talking about in Canada specifically or in general? In general, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one thing that I didn't get to talk about was that, like, I feel like my presentation makes it seem like Australia succeeded and Canada failed, and my conclusion is very different. It's that
Many would agree with you, though.
I mean, I think that that's true to a certain extent, but in a lot of ways, Canada has done so much more than you compare to what the U.S. has done and several other countries around the world, right, who have committed these historical wrongs and done absolutely nothing about it. So no, the apology wasn't perfect, but was it something? Definitely. So I would say that first, and I guess, so your question is like whether or not indigenous topics can...
Are they a vehicle for oppositional parties to take control or overthrow majority leaders or whatnot?
Right. Well, I think Australia is an amazing example of that, right? That
Yeah.
Kevin Rudd's major campaign platform was about indigenous rights and about providing this apology. And Australians, for whatever reason, were so committed to this idea and supportive of it, it ended up winning him the election. He didn't stay in power very long, right? He offered his apology, was very well received. Good things happened from it, and then he left. I think in his case, it did, very much help him get to power and help him get what he wanted to get done. And I think there's so many different dynamics that are at play, in each country about whether or not that can work. So I can't say because it worked there, it can work anywhere. I can't say that. But I think when the right time happens, I think a lot of things can happen. Like, for instance, here having Barack Obama as our first, black president here, I think a lot of people would have said that would have never been possible. And just the right things were at play at the time, right, where he got elected. And he's actually, even though there's no apology, he's actually done a lot more for Native Americans in this country than a lot of our past presidents. So yes, I think so.